All right, how's it going, everyone? I'm going to try a video just to spice things up for this last discussion of this semester. So the questions are, the first question is, what are the major goals of authentic and alternative assessment? These are largely the same type of thing. The standard test is something that you're kind of measuring what students know, the standardized test, whereas authentic and alternative assessment is really looking at students' abilities, in this case, their proficiency, their competency, what they can and what they can't do. And due to the challenges, if you remember the Color in Colorado video series, there's really three challenges that are mentioned: language, culture, and educational experiences. And these things can be challenging for learners on the standardized test because first language literacy comes into play, and if they don't have a high level of first language literacy, then they're likely not going to do very well in second language literacy, especially on a standardized test. Their language comes into play. Some languages like Spanish, Portuguese, and so on and so forth that have a high number of cognates. Typically you see learners of those languages have greater speaking and listening abilities as compared to reading and writing abilities. Whereas conversely, it's common for Asian speakers to really have developed their reading and writing skills as compared to their listening and speaking skills. And so that can be challenging. And also culture comes into play. I see this all the time in my personal classes where it's different, especially for Asian learners, to be involved in more student-centered kind of learning. They're typically used to a little bit more teacher-centric learning. So those can be challenges for those learners. Authentic testing can happen at any time and should happen at any time if we're talking about what we've learned from both the Pearson SciUp model video, but then also what we learned from Echeverria, Vogt, and Short is that assessing needs to happen at the beginning of an activity to ascertain students' abilities. It needs to happen during a learning activity to be able to determine how effective the learning activity is and how well the students are performing. And then it also needs to happen at the end to really assess their knowledge gains, but also to assess their competency. And the data that you generate from that assessment allows you to know if there's some things that did not go well, if you need to repeat things, or if there are certain areas where students are still weak, so that you can provide additional teaching support for those areas. One thing that's a challenge about traditional assessments that alternative or authentic tests can be helpful with is that traditional tests usually aren't looking holistically at students' performances, and they typically can't take into account cultural aspects that influence student performance. This is according to the Brown, Park, Shell, and Benedict 2017 article. And so their recommendation was portfolios based on both formal and informal tests that allow teachers to really have this holistic view of how they perform in the 4 different skill sets: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In addition, it would probably be very useful to look at how they're performing with their grammar and also their vocabulary knowledge. And these portfolios typically take into account the students' background knowledge and also what they can do in a language and a plan of intervention for the future in regards to help students really continue to buttress their strengths, but also to address the weaknesses that they have. This is important because when we're looking at standardized tests, typically our ELLs are doing really poorly, according to Honigsfeld and Giorgakis 2011 article. The ELLs struggle on these things. And usually it's because these high stakes tests weren't these tests weren't developed with an ELL in mind. Usually they're developed with native English speakers who have a fairly strong grasp of the social cultural paradigms of the United States. So their recommendation is that through alternative testing, you can really tailor your instruction to be able to take into account cultural aspects and really help them to develop the knowledge that they need with a really culturally responsive approach. The second question is, how does authentic assessment bring value to teaching and learning for ELs? I mentioned this before, but authentic assessment, instead of it being a one-shot knowledge diagnostic, it's really, especially if you're adopting the portfolio approach of that Brown, Park, Shell, and Benedict propose, you're looking at holistically at all the 4 skills, and you're looking at their body of work over a period of time rather than a one-stop shop. And so these can be really, really valuable because they're not high stakes. They show more competency. They show what the student is able to do versus what a student might know at one given point of time. Thank you.